On the night of September 2, 1942, three Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes approached a German ammunition depot near the Mius River in southern Russia. The depot was defended by a ring of searchlights, approximately 40 of them, positioned in concentric circles around the facility. This was standard German anti-aircraft doctrine by late 1942, searchlights to acquire targets, flak guns to destroy them. The searchlights were Flakscheinwerfer 37, each producing 150 million candlepower, capable of illuminating aircraft at altitudes up to 5,000 meters. When one searchlight caught an aircraft, others would lock on to the same target, creating a cage of light that the pilot couldn't escape. Once illuminated, the aircraft became a perfect target for 37mm and 20mm flak batteries. This defense had been devastatingly effective. Po-2s caught in searchlights typically had less than 30 seconds before flak destroyed them. The three night witches approaching the depot that night knew this. They'd lost crews to searchlights before. What the German defenders didn't know was that these three aircraft weren't approaching as individuals. They were approaching as a coordinated team, executing a tactic that had been invented, tested, and refined over the previous 2 months of operations. A tactic that would transform how the 588th Night Bomber Regiment conducted missions for the rest of the war. Aircraft 1 and Aircraft 2 flew directly toward the searchlight ring at 1,200 meters altitude, engines running normally, making no attempt at stealth. The searchlights found them immediately. First one light, then another, then 5 more, then 10, then 20. Both aircraft were fully illuminated, locked in cones of light so bright that the pilots couldn't see their own instruments. Flak opened up. 37mm shells exploded around them, creating black bursts visible even in the searchlight glare. Aircraft 1 turned hard right, Aircraft 2 turned hard left. The searchlights followed them, operators tracking the maneuvering targets, trying to keep them illuminated for the flak gunners. While every searchlight in the defensive ring followed Aircraft 1 and 2, Aircraft 3 approached from a different angle, engine cut, gliding silently through the darkness. No lights tracked it, no flak fired at it. The German defenders had committed everything to the 2 illuminated targets and had nothing left for the third. At 900 meters altitude, Aircraft 3's navigator released both bombs. Direct hits. The ammunition depot exploded. Secondary explosions destroyed adjacent storage facilities. Aircraft 3 restarted its engine and escaped at low altitude. Aircraft 1 and 2, still maneuvering wildly to avoid flak, heard the explosion behind them and turned toward base. Mission accomplished. 0 aircraft lost. This was searchlight suppression. This was the tactic that made German defenses useless. Can 3 pilots in wooden biplanes neutralize 40 searchlights and hundreds of flak guns through coordination alone? Can a tactic invented by necessity become doctrine? Please like this video to see how this developed. Subscribe for more Night Witches stories. And let's go back to June 1942, when the problem first revealed itself. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment deployed to the Southern Front in late May 1942 and flew its first combat mission on June 8th. The mission targeted a German divisional headquarters near the Mius River. 3 aircraft participated. The attack was successful. Bombs hit the target. Buildings were destroyed. But 1 aircraft was lost. The pilot and navigator were killed. This 33% casualty rate on the regiment's first mission was unsustainable. If every mission cost 1/3 of the attacking force, the regiment would cease to exist within weeks. The cause of the loss was searchlights. The lost aircraft had been caught by searchlights during its approach, illuminated and destroyed by flak before it could drop its bombs or escape. The surviving crews reported that German searchlight defenses were far more extensive than expected. Every significant target, headquarters, supply depots, fuel storage, rail junctions, was defended by rings of searchlights. These weren't improvised defenses. They were systematic, well-coordinated, and lethal. The fundamental problem was that the Po-2's advantages, slow speed, maneuverability, wood and canvas construction invisible to radar, were completely negated by searchlights. Radar couldn't detect wooden aircraft, but searchlights didn't need radar. They swept the sky continuously. Once one light found an aircraft, others converged. The PO-2's slow speed, usually an advantage, became a liability. The aircraft couldn't outrun the lights. It could only maneuver, and maneuvering while illuminated just gave flak gunners a moving target to practice on. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment's commander, understood that the problem was tactical, not technical. The aircraft couldn't be modified. They were what they were. The pilots couldn't fly faster. The PO-2's maximum speed was fixed. The solution had to come from how missions were conducted. She called a tactical conference in mid-June 1942, approximately 1 week after the first combat mission. Every pilot and navigator available attended. The question posed, how do we attack defended targets without being destroyed by searchlights? Multiple suggestions were offered. Approach from higher altitude, but the PO-2's service ceiling was only 3,000 meters and searchlights reached 5,000 meters. Approach when the moon was down, but many targets required specific timing regardless of lunar phase. Attack only targets without searchlight defenses. But that would render the regiment useless for most strategic missions. Every suggestion had a flaw. The discussion continued for hours. Then someone, accounts vary on who, though several sources credit either Nadezhda Popova or Yevdokia Bershanskaya herself, proposed a different approach. What if we don't avoid the searchlights? What if we use them? The idea was counterintuitive. Using searchlights meant being illuminated, and being illuminated meant being shot down. But the proposal had a specific logic. Searchlights have limited numbers. Searchlight operators have limited attention. If we deliberately attract all the searchlights to aircraft that aren't carrying out the primary attack, those lights can't track other aircraft. It's a distraction tactic, like a magician directing attention to one hand while the other performs the trick. The mechanics were straightforward: 3 aircraft instead of 1. 2 aircraft, the decoys or searchers, would approach openly, allowing themselves to be illuminated. They would maneuver wildly to hold the searchlight's attention and avoid being shot down. While the searchlights tracked the decoys, the 3rd aircraft, the bomber, would glide in from a different direction in darkness, hit the target, and escape. Then the 3 aircraft would rotate roles. The decoys would become bombers. The bomber would become a decoy, until all 3 aircraft had dropped their bombs. The tactic had risks. The decoys were deliberately exposing themselves to the full weight of German defenses. They would be illuminated, tracked, fired upon. Their survival depended on violent maneuvering in an aircraft not designed for violent maneuvering. The PO-2 could turn tightly, but it was still a wooden biplane with limited structural strength. Too aggressive a maneuver could overstress the airframe. Too gentle a maneuver wouldn't shake the searchlights. The decoy pilots had to find the exact edge between too much and not enough, and they had to find it while being shot at. But the alternative was worse. Without searchlight suppression, every aircraft approaching a defended target would be illuminated, tracked, and likely destroyed. The casualty rate would remain unsustainable. The regiment would cease to be effective. Searchlight suppression at least offered a chance. The tactic was approved for field testing in late June 1942. The first test mission occurred on June 24, 1942. The target was a German supply depot near Rostov. 3 aircraft participated: Nadezhda Popova and Katya Ryabova as Decoy 1, Yevgenia Rudneva with her pilot as Decoy 2, and a 3rd crew as the bomber. They approached the target in a loose formation. Popova and the 2nd decoy flew directly toward the searchlight ring. The lights found them immediately. Both aircraft turned hard, Popova right, the other left. The searchlights followed them. While the German defenders focused on the illuminated aircraft, the 3rd crew glided in from the north, dropped bombs, hit the target, and escaped. 0 losses. The tactic worked. Understanding what worked meant requires understanding what the decoys experienced. Nadezhda Popova described the first Searchlight suppression mission in detail in post-war interviews. When the first searchlight caught her aircraft, she was temporarily blinded. The light was so bright it washed out her vision completely for several seconds. She couldn't see her instruments, couldn't see the horizon, couldn't see anything except white glare. She turned hard right by feel, pulling the stick right and hoping the aircraft responded correctly. More lights locked onto her. The cockpit was illuminated as brightly as daylight. Then flak started. She could hear the shells exploding, sharp cracks, some close enough that fragments hit the wings. She couldn't see where the fire was coming from. She could only maneuver continuously and hope she stayed ahead of the tracking solutions. Meanwhile, her navigator, Katya Ryabova, in the rear cockpit, was watching the other decoy aircraft and the target. Ryabova could see the second decoy, also fully illuminated, also maneuvering wildly, tracers streaming past it. She could see flak bursts creating black clouds in the searchlight beams. And beyond the lights, in the darkness past the target, she could just barely perceive the third aircraft on its gliding approach. No lights tracked it. It was invisible to the German defenders. As Popova continued turning right, then left, then right again, randomizing her movements to prevent the flak crews from predicting her path, Ryabova watched the dark bomber release its payload. The explosion lit up the target area. Popova saw the flash, understood the mission was successful, and turned toward escape. The searchlights followed her for approximately 10 more seconds, then released as she flew beyond their effective range. When Popova landed, ground crew counted holes. 3 hits, 2 through fabric on the upper wing, 1 through the vertical stabilizer. None had hit anything critical. No control cables severed, no structural members damaged. But they could have. Any one of those fragments could have been 6 inches left or right and hit something that would have brought the aircraft down. The margin between success and catastrophe was that thin, but worked was relative. The decoy aircraft had been illuminated for approximately 45 seconds each. During that time, they'd been subjected to continuous flak fire. Popova's aircraft took 3 hits, 2 through the upper wing, 1 through the tail section. None were critical, but any of them could have been. The margin of survival was thin. Post-mission debriefing identified several problems. First, the decoys needed better coordination. If both decoys turned in the same direction, the searchlights could track both simultaneously. They needed to split immediately and randomly. Second, the bomber needed to approach from the opposite side of the target from the decoys. If the bomber approached from the same side, its engine noise or movement might be detected even while the lights were distracted. Third, the timing was critical. The decoys needed to attract attention long enough for the bomber to complete its run, but not so long that they were shot down. Fourth, and this became critical, the decoys needed a clear signal from the bomber that bombs were away so they knew when to disengage. Without radio communication, this meant visual signals, a specific engine sound change, a flare, something observable even while illuminated and under fire. The refinement process happened rapidly because the regiment flew missions every night that weather permitted. Each mission provided data. What worked was retained. What failed was discarded. By the 10th Searchlight suppression mission, certain patterns had emerged. Decoys that turned in opposite directions immediately upon illumination survived longer than those who turned in the same direction or delayed the turn. Bombers approaching from exactly opposite the decoy's position had the highest success rate. Decoys that varied their turn timing unpredictably confused flak gunners more effectively than those who turned at regular intervals. These observations became doctrine. One particularly instructive mission occurred on July 15, 1942. The target was a rail junction near Taganrog, defended by an estimated 50 searchlights, one of the most heavily defended targets the 588th had encountered. 3 aircraft participated, 2 decoys and 1 bomber. The decoys approached from the west at 1,200 meters. The searchlights found them immediately. Both turned sharply, one north, one south. The lights split, roughly half tracking each aircraft. But the sheer number of lights meant that even split, each decoy was being tracked by 20-25 lights simultaneously. The illumination was overwhelming. The pilots couldn't see anything except glare. The bomber approached from the east, opposite the decoys. It glided silently toward the rail junction, but the German defenders had stationed additional searchlights on the east side, specifically to counter approaches from unexpected directions. 2 lights caught the bomber at 800 meters altitude. Within seconds, 6 more lights locked on. The bomber was illuminated. Flak shifted fire from the decoys to the bomber. The bomber's pilot had a decision: abort and escape, or complete the run while under fire. She completed the run. Bombs dropped at 600 meters. Direct hit on the rail junction. The bomber restarted its engine and dove to 100 meters, escaping below the searchlight's minimum depression angle. The decoys, seeing the explosion, broke off their maneuvers and escaped. All 3 aircraft returned. The bomber had 2 holes in its wings. The decoys had 5 hits combined. Post-mission analysis revealed a flaw. The tactic assumed German defenses would commit all searchlights to tracking the decoys. But well-prepared defenses kept reserve lights searching continuously for additional threats. The solution was to add a 4th element: additional decoys approaching from a 3rd direction to occupy reserve searchlights. But the 588th typically flew missions with limited aircraft. Adding a 4th aircraft to every mission wasn't always feasible. The compromise was to use 4 aircraft on heavily defended targets and 3 on moderately defended targets. Another refinement involved timing the decoy's disengagement. Originally, decoys would break off and escape as soon as the bomber hit its target. But this telegraphed to the German defenders that an attack had just occurred from an unobserved direction. They would redirect searchlights and fire toward the likely approach vector even without visual contact. The revised tactic had decoys continue maneuvering for 10-15 seconds after the bomber's attack, then disengage. This delayed the German response and gave the bomber more time to escape. The most dangerous refinement involved decoys bombing the searchlights themselves. After the primary target was hit, instead of immediately disengaging, decoys would identify searchlight positions and drop their bombs on them. This required flying toward the lights, toward the thing that was illuminating them and guiding flak fire to their position. It required extraordinary courage and precise navigation. The navigator needed to calculate a release point that would hit a searchlight position while the aircraft was itself illuminated and under fire, with the pilot maneuvering violently. Many navigators couldn't do it. Some who tried missed. But those who succeeded destroyed the lights, degrading German defenses for future missions. Rufina Gasheva and Olga Sanfirova became specialists in searchlight bombing. In September 1942, during the multi-mission convoy attack that would make them famous, they also destroyed 2 searchlight positions. Their technique involved approaching a searchlight from the side rather than head-on. This gave the navigator a broader target profile and more time to calculate. It also meant flying parallel to the defensive perimeter while illuminated, which extended exposure time. But it worked. Over the course of 2 missions that night, they damaged 1 searchlight severely enough that it couldn't be used for the rest of the engagement and destroyed another completely with a direct hit on its power generator. By October 1942, searchlight suppression had become second nature to experienced crews. They could execute it with the precision of a rehearsed performance, but it remained dangerous. On October 19, 1942, a 3-aircraft mission to attack a German command post near Mozdok demonstrated both the tactic's effectiveness and its risks. The 2 decoys attracted 30-plus searchlights. While the lights tracked them, the bomber approached and hit the target. The explosion was visible for miles. Mission accomplished. But as the decoys disengaged, 1 aircraft, piloted by Zhenya Rudneva's friend Lyudmila Gubina, was caught in a searchlight beam that she couldn't shake. She maneuvered continuously, but the light stayed locked on. Flak concentrated. At some point, a shell struck the aircraft's fuel tank or ignited the canvas covering. The Po-2 burned. Gubina and her navigator died. The other two aircraft returned safely. Success and tragedy in the same mission. The story of Searchlight suppression in miniature. These refinements were implemented over the next several missions. By late July 1942, Searchlight suppression had evolved from an experimental tactic to standard operating procedure. Every mission to a defended target used the three-aircraft pattern: decoys, bomber, rotation. The casualty rate dropped dramatically. The regiment could now attack targets that had been previously considered too well defended. The tactic's effectiveness created a secondary effect. It destroyed searchlights. Once the bomber had hit its primary target, the decoys didn't just escape. They dropped their bombs on the searchlight positions themselves. They damaged or destroyed 17 river crossings, 9 railways, 2 railway stations, 26 warehouses, 12 fuel depots, 176 armored cars, 86 prepared firing positions, and 11 searchlights. 11 searchlights destroyed over the course of the war sounds modest until you understand what destroying a searchlight meant. Each Flakscheinwerfer 37 required a crew of 4, a dedicated power source, maintenance, and coordination with flak batteries. Destroying one searchlight degraded the entire defensive network. German defenders would reposition remaining lights to cover the gap, creating holes elsewhere in the coverage. These holes became opportunities for future attacks. The psychological impact on German defenders was also significant. They began to distrust their own searchlights. When lights found aircraft, defenders knew they might be tracking decoys while the real threat approached from darkness. This uncertainty degraded defensive effectiveness even when searchlight suppression wasn't being used. Just the possibility that it might be used forced German defenders to split their attention. By August 1942, German intelligence had identified the tactic and issued countermeasures. Searchlight operators were instructed to ignore obviously maneuvering aircraft and sweep continuously for others. Flak batteries were directed to fire at both illuminated and suspected dark approaches. Additional night fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-1910s, equipped with searchlights and radar, were assigned to counter the night witches specifically. These countermeasures were partially effective. The 588th's casualty rate increased in August, particularly on August 1, 1943, when Joseph Kochiok's night fighter attacks killed 8 women in one night. But the fundamental logic of searchlight suppression remained sound. 3 aircraft coordinating could still defeat defenses that had been designed to track individual aircraft. The tactic evolved continuously. Different approach angles, variable timing, decoys that would deliberately turn toward flak positions to draw fire away from the bomber's escape route. By 1943, the 588th was executing searchlight suppression missions with a precision that suggested years of practice rather than months. The broader Soviet Air Force noticed. By late 1943, other night harassment regiments were adopting similar tactics. The concept of coordinated approach and deliberate distraction became part of Soviet night bombing doctrine. This wasn't officially credited to the 588th. Soviet military doctrine didn't typically credit tactical innovations to specific units, especially all-female units. But the pilots who flew it knew where it came from. They knew that Popova, Rudneva, Bershanskaya, and others had invented this under fire, tested it, and proven it worked. Searchlight suppression required trust. The decoys were trusting that the bomber would hit the target and make their sacrifice worthwhile. The bomber was trusting that the decoys would hold the lights long enough for the approach. All 3 crews were trusting that the others would execute their roles precisely, because imprecision meant death. This trust was built over hundreds of missions. Crews who flew together regularly developed wordless communication. A slight change in engine pitch meant, "I'm starting my turn." A specific maneuver pattern meant, "I'm hit, need help." These signals weren't in any manual. They emerged organically from crews who'd flown together so many times that they could predict each other's actions. That's the story of Searchlight suppression, the tactic that transformed the Night Witches from experimental unit to effective combat force. 2 decoys deliberately attracting every searchlight and flak gun in the defense network, while a 3rd aircraft glides in through darkness and hits the target. It required coordination. It required courage. It required accepting that decoy meant target and flying anyway. And it worked. 11 searchlights destroyed. Hundreds of missions flown against defended targets. Casualty rates reduced from unsustainable to survivable. If this story reminds you that sometimes the solution is to run directly at the problem instead of away from it, that coordinated action beats individual heroics, and that tactics matter as much as technology, hit that like button. Subscribe for more Night Witches stories and tactical innovations born from desperation. Turn on notifications. Comment with what you'd remember if you were teaching this tactic to others. We read everyone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.